Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf is about sugis of taroves, when Isser and Heter, permitted and forbidden foods mixed together, when you can eat the mixture and when you have to remove certain parts of it. It begins with a Mishnah at the bottom of Daf Ayin Hey, which discusses the halachos of when part of a carbon Pesach is cooked or heated by something which is a puzzle source of heat. The Gemara will open the discussion of Tatagavar versus Ilagavar, well-known machlokes Rav and Shmuel, about when hot and cold fall on each other, which one is stronger. And then we'll get to the sugya of Reicha, smell, how much smell asers and how much fattiness asers. And the Gemara will bring a number of proofs to these from our Mishnah. So first of all, the Mishnah is discussing a carbon Pesach. As we have seen, the halacha of a carbon Pesach is that it must be roasted in a fire. It cannot be cooked in liquid, and it cannot be heated by something hot other than fire. You can't have it heated by metal or by earthenware or anything else. So the Mishnah discusses a number of cases here and how you can fix them. So the first case is that if the carbon itself touched the wall of the oven. Now the wall of the oven is made out of cheres, made out of earthenware. When that wall is hot, the spot that it touches is not tzli it's tzli oven. It's tzli through the wall of the oven. So that has to be removed. So the Mishnah says you just have to remove a klipa. That is the thinnest layer that you could remove in one shot. You could just remove that because that's the spot that becomes us, so the rest of it beyond that layer is permitted. Now, however, if a drop of fat sprays or spills off the carbon, hits the wall of the oven, and then bounces back, so now what happened is that spot, that drop, was heated by the wall of the oven, and now it's carrying heat from the wall of the oven onto the carbon itself. Now, the drop itself becomes Isser, because the drop is heated by the wall of the oven. When that falls on the carbon, you're going to have a fatty liquid of Isser relative to the carbon that's on the carbon itself. So what do you got to do? So you have to remove a Kedena Tila. It's about an inch worth because it's fatty, so we consider that the flavor of the fattiness seeps through the carbon for about an inch, and you got to remove all that. Now, if a drop of liquid, of fat, falls on flour, so you have to remove a handful of flour, not just to remove the spot of the liquid itself, the fat itself. You have to remove an entire handful. What if you took the carbon and you smeared it with oil? So the Gemara says, the Mishnah says if the oil was truma, so kahanim are allowed to eat it. If the chabura, however, is Yisraelim, are not allowed to eat it. So as long as the carbon's raw, before it's roasted, you can just wash it off. Scrub it off, wash it off, it's fine. If, however, you roasted it, you have to remove a thin layer. The Gemara will explain why you don't have to remove more than a thin layer. But you have to remove a klipa, the thinnest layer of it. Now, if the oil was Meiser Sheni, so Meiser Sheni is heter, Yisraelim are allowed to eat it. However, it has to be eaten in Yerushalayim. And it can only be redeemed if you leave Yerushalayim. So the person who smeared it on cannot charge the people who are eating the carbon the value of that oil, because you can't sell the oil inside Yerushalayim. You can only sell it outside Yerushalayim, and therefore, because the carbon obviously has to be in Yerushalayim, you cannot charge them for it. Okay, the Gemara now discusses the concept of Tatagavar and Ilagavar. That's as follows. If you have hot and cold items, one falls on the other. So the question is as follows. There's a competition between the two. The hot item is trying to heat the cold item, the cold item is trying to cool the hot item. The question is which is stronger and which happens first. If the hot heats the cold before it gets cooled itself, it'll cook the cold, it'll transfer flavor into the cold. On the other hand, if the cold manages to cool it first, then it will not get any flavor from it. So the Gemara says that it depends which one's on top, which one's on the bottom, but we have a machlokes Rav and Shmuel. According to Rav, the upper one is stronger. So if the hot is on top, it'll heat it, and it'll transfer Isser. If the cold is on top, it'll cool, and there will not be any transfer of Isser. According to Shmuel, the bottom one is stronger, and if the bottom one is hot, then it'll heat the top one, and it'll transfer Isser. And if the bottom one is cold, then it'll cool the top one, and it will not transfer Isser. And the Gemara wants to know what halacha is. The Gemara is going to bring three potential proofs from our Mishnah to Rav, reject them all, and then have two Mishnahs that are explicitly like Shmuel, and Rashi points out that although normally we paskin in Isser questions like Rav, here the halach will be like Shmuel because there are two Mishnahs explicitly like him. So first of all, the proofs from our Mishnah. So what are the proofs? So the first is from the first case. The Mishnah says that if a drop of liquid fell on the wall of the oven and then it bounced back onto the carbon, you have to take off a kedei netila. Now the Gemara is assuming that this wall of the oven here is cold. If that being the case, what's the problem? So the Gemara says the problem must be that the drop was hot, it's boiling. The drop fell on the wall of the oven, it heated the wall of the oven, then the wall of the oven reheated the drop. That then became Isser and went back onto the carbon. So you see that the wall of the oven which is cold is managing to heat the drop. The wall of the oven which is cold is being heated by the drop that falls on it. And then it's transferring heat into the drop itself afterwards. So that means that the upper thing is stronger. The drop which is falling on the wall is transferring heat into it before it itself cools. So Gemara therefore says that's a proof that Ilogavar, like Rav, the upper thing is stronger. So the Gemara says this is not a proof because it's talking about where the wall of the oven was hot, and therefore it transferred heat directly into the drop that fell on it. It did not require to be heated by the drop that fell on it, but really Shmuel could be right that the lower thing is stronger and it would cool the drop if it was cold. Now the Gemara has a very similar proof from the case of the flour. We said that in the flour, you have to, if a drop falls in the flour, you have to remove a handful of the flour. Why a handful? Why don't you just remove the drop and the kernels, the flakes of flour that touched the drop? So the Gemara says, obviously the heat is spreading around the flour. Now why is it doing that? It must be doing that because the drop is heating it. The drop is heating it. The drop is the top thing. It's falling on the cold flour. It's again proving that the upper thing is stronger, like Rav. So Gemara says, no, we're talking about where the flour was hot, and therefore it's not a problem over here at all. Okay, now the Gemara goes to the third thing. We had said that if you smeared oil on it and it's truma, and it's hot, you have to take off a kedei klipa. Now, the carbon is hot. The carbon is the bottom thing here. The oil that you smeared on of truma is cold. According to Shmuel, we have a problem. According to Shmuel, the bottom thing is hot. It should overpower the top thing, and it should spread. It should heat it up, and it should spread the flavor all the way through the carbon itself. Why do you only have to take off a thin layer, a kedei klipa? According to Rav, I understand the klipa itself is where it contacted. That's where it becomes iser. Even though the upper oil cools off the carbon, which is hot, the upper cools the lower, the upper overpowers the lower. Still a kedei klipa, a thin amount, it does aser. But according to Shmuel, it should spread throughout the whole thing. So the Gemara says the reason that it doesn't spread throughout the whole thing is because it's just a thin layer of oil. It only has volume enough to get a thin layer into the carbon itself. There is not enough oil to go further. You're right that the power of movement, the power of heat, the power of cooking is enough to transfer the Isser oil as far as it could go, which could be all the way through, or it could be a kedei netila. But here you don't have enough oil to create more than a klipa of Isser, and that's why you don't have any Isser going further. Okay, now the Gemara quotes two brises which say explicitly like Shmuel. The brises are exactly the same, except that one is talking about Isser and Heter, and one is talking about meat and milk. And the brises say as follows: hot falls into hot, everything becomes Usser. It transfers flavor all the way around. If cold falls into cold, or hot falls onto cold, everything becomes permitted. It goes all the way. There is no Isser transferred because the hot falling on the cold is cooled by the bottom. If, however, cold falls into hot, then it does aser because the bottom is stronger and it heats up the cold and it overpowers it. Now the Gemara points out in both of these brises that when we say that hot falling onto cold, it becomes cooled and it doesn't aser anything, it's not true it doesn't aser anything, it does aser kedei klipa. Until it's cooled off, it does have the power to infuse flavor of iser into at least a thin layer of the cold food that it is falling upon. Okay, now the Gemara goes into a number of other ways that flavor can be transferred even without heat. So the Gemara says something which is very salty transfers heat. The Gemara quotes Shmuel on that. The Gemara says that it's only if it's salty enough that you couldn't eat it because of the saltiness. Rashi says it doesn't mean that it's impossible to put in your mouth. It means that the flavor is ruined because it's too salty. And if it's not too salty, if it's just regular amount of salting, then it's not considered to be hot. It's not considered to be absorbent. It's the sharpness of the salt and the salty liquid that forms that transfers the flavor. The Gemara says similar to that is if you have something which is kavush, that it is pickled in vinegar, that also gives a sharpness to it that transfers the flavor. The Gemara has a story here. The Gemara has an incident that a bird fell into a pot of kutach. Kutach is milchik. It contains whey in it. Gemara says Rav Chanan or Brei Rava mi Pashrunya said that it's permitted, and Rava said that's because he is very wise. Kutach contains salt, and therefore we may have had a problem. It's salty and it is also milky. It's got milk in it, and therefore it should potentially aser the bird, the meat that fell into it. But we say that it's okay. Why? Because it's not salty enough. Because it's edible. Hari kutach is food, and therefore it's something that you do eat despite the saltiness. It's not salty enough to cause a problem of iser. The Gemara has other situations in which flavor is transferred. The Gemara says this is all that we're discussing up to now where you have raw meat, but if you had roasted meat, then it would transfer a klipa's amount. A klipa layer does go through. The Gemara also says that that's only if there's no cracks or if it's not spiced. Now, there's a machlokes rishonim what cracks and spice is going on. Simplest understanding is that it's going on in the case of the roasted meat and saying that the flavor transfers a klipa into the meat if it is roasted, but it transfers a kedei netila. It transfers further than a klipa. It transfers about an inch or so if the meat is cracked or if it is very spiced. The spices soften it and allow more transferring. Okay, now the Gemara concludes that discussion, and the Gemara moves on to a discussion of what is the halacha of smell. Now, smell means as follows. You have two foods that are roasting together in an oven, and they are not touching each other. There is, however, a scent that transfers from one to the other. Now, we're talking about a situation where there's no steam. Why, how do we avoid steam? Whatever the situation is, steam is not a problem, because if you have two items in an oven, you could potentially have steam transferring from one to the other. But assuming there's no steam, what is the halacha of the smell? Does the smell transfer Isser or not? So the Gemara says it's a machlokes between Rav and Levi. Rav says yes, smell transfers Isser. Levi says no, smell does not transfer Isser. Rav even goes further, and Rav says that the halacha is that smell really only transfers Isser if there's a fattiness. But the fattiness doesn't have to be the Isser that's fatty. It could be the heter that's fatty. So if you have two pieces of meat, one is Isser and one is heter. Let's say one's slaughtered properly and one is nevela, and they're in an oven. So if either one of them is fatty, so Rav says the fattiness will help the smell transfer flavor from one piece of meat to the other. Even if the heter is the fatty one, what could happen is that the fattiness of the heter could affect the smell coming from the Isser, and it could cause it to transfer. And therefore, it doesn't matter which one is fatty, you do have a problem. Levi, as we said, says the smell is not a problem at all, and therefore we don't have to worry about any of these halachas. Doesn't matter who's fatty, they're all fatty. Smell is not going to transfer Isser, smell is not considered a thing. Now, Levi did a similar story. He passed in this halacha l'maisa. There was a case in the house of the Reish Galusa, somebody roasted kosher meat in the same oven at the same time as a pig was being roasted, and he said it's mutter. You don't have to worry about the transferring of smell from the pig to the kosher meat. Now the Gemara goes into this discussion and brings proofs. The first proof comes from the halachas of carbon Pesach. The Gemara quotes a brisa. Brisa says that, as we know, if you have two carbon Pesachs, they are Isser relative to each other. Why is that? Because people registered for one. Each one has a group of people registered for it. They're not registered for the other carbon. If they're not registered for the other carbon, they cannot eat from that carbon. So if flavor or meat or somehow they get mixed up with those with a different carbon, that will be Isser to them. They're not registered for it. So Gemara quotes this brisa, which says you're allowed that you should not roast two carbon pesachs together. Now the Gemara's understanding that this means you have two carbonos roasting on a spit in the same oven. And what's the problem? So the brisa says because you may get tarovis, you may get mixtures. So Gemara assumes mixtures. What does mixtures mean? Mixtures means that you'll have transfer of flavor from one to the other. How would that happen? It must be because of smell. Proof to Rav that smell is the problem. The Gemara says no, the problem here is not smell. The problem is you may get confused and each chabura will take the wrong one. You'll end up taking the wrong one. The Gemara says I prove to you that that's the concern because the brisa goes further and it says even if one's a goat and one's a sheep. Now, if the concern here is flavors, so what does it make a difference? Why do you have to tell me even if one's a goat and one's a sheep? Why would that be an issue? Obviously, the flavors is not the concern. The concern is that you'll get confused. And the Mishnah comes to tell me that even though they are distinguishable, and you would think I wouldn't get mixed up because one's a goat and one's a sheep, you might get mixed up anyway. You may not pay attention to what you're taking, or remember what you brought, and therefore you shouldn't roast 2 carbon Pesachs together because it leads to problems. Now this proves, though, says the Gemara, the other way. This proves to Levi, because obviously the only problem is the mixing up. The flavor transfer is not the concern. So Gemara says, okay, I wouldn't go so far as to say that that's a proof. We could be talking about a situation where the smell transfer, the smell is blocked. So the Gemara says, what would that situation be? Well, if there's a divider between them, it's almost like they're in 2 separate pots. They couldn't actually be in a pot because the carbon Pesach has to be roasted and it can't be put into a pot. But if there's a divider, if there's a wall of ashes or coals between them, or there's something between them that prevents the smell from transferring, that is why the concern here would only be confusion of the 2 carbonos and taking the wrong one, as opposed to transfer of actual flavor. Our second proof is not a proof to one side or another. It's a proof that it's actually machlokas tanoim. The Gemara is going to say that it's a machlokas tanoim according to Levi, but it doesn't have to be a machlokas tanoim according to Rav. What's the Mishnah? So the Brisa has 3 opinions about if somebody who takes bread out of the oven puts it on top of a barrel of truma. Now, it may soak up the smell of truma wine, the truma is wine, it may soak up the smell of the truma wine and therefore make the bread usser. So does it do that or not? So the Gemara says that Rameir says yes, it soaks up the smell of the truma wine and therefore makes it usser. Therefore, there is definitely opinion here that holds that smell is a problem, and this definitely doesn't fit with Levi. Now, the other opinions are Rabbi Yehuda says that it's mutter. So the Gemara says maybe that is against Rav, and therefore Rav also has to accept this as a machlokas tanaim. The Gemara will say that no, Rabbi Yehuda really could fit with Rav. And there's opinion of Rabbi Yossi that says it depends what the bread is made out of. If it's made out of barley, then it will soak it up. If it's made out of wheat, then it won't soak it up. The opinions of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi clearly hold that there are times, at least, in which smell could be a problem, and therefore they don't fit with Levi. Rabbi Yehuda that says that it's mutter, is it because he holds like Levi that there is no problem of smell at all, or is there a different reason here? So the Gemara says, well, I'll tell you there's a different reason. And that's as follows. We've seen that the explanation of this brisa is as follows. There are 2 variables here. What is the bread hot, and is the barrel covered? If it's hot and uncovered, smell is definitely a problem. Nobody argues about that, Rav says. If it's closed and sealed, the smell doesn't get through, and therefore there's no problem. The machlokas is not about whether smell is a problem or not. Smell is always potentially a problem. The machlokas is what happens if the bread's hot, but the barrel is covered, or if the bread's cold and the barrel is uncovered, does smell get through or not? And that is what they're arguing about. But I will explain it as they all agree that smell is potentially a problem. That's not the issue. Levi will say no. Levi will say that the issue is smell a problem or not. That's what the machlokas is. Okay, going further in the halachos of smell, the Gemara says you shouldn't roast meat of iser in the oven at the same time as you're baking bread, because there will be a transfer of smell to the bread. If you do that, the bread becomes fleshik. If the meat is heter, the bread becomes fleshik, and you cannot eat it together with kutach or any other type of cheese product. Whereas an incident that happened where somebody roasted fish together with meat in the oven, Rava mi parzikaya said that it's fleshik, you can't eat it with cheese, and Mar bar Ravashi said you should never eat it because fish and meat with transferred flavor causes taras and other health problems, and therefore you shouldn't eat it at all. This takes us to the next Mishnah. The Mishnah goes back to the halachos of karbanos and kachim, and it talks about where you bring a carbon bituma. The halacha is you're allowed to bring a carbon bituma if it's a carbon for a large group of people, for a tzibur, and the majority of the tzibur is tameh. Says the Mishnah, you are allowed to bring karbanos bituma if the tzibur is tameh, but if it's a carbon tzibur that is eaten, it may not be eaten. You can bring the carbon works, but eating is forbidden bituma. Now, there are only 5 types of karbonos tzibur that are eaten, and therefore these are the 5 that if they're brought bituma, they can't be eaten, and the Mishnah lists them all, and they are the carbon ha'omer, brought to permit grain on the second day of Pesach. They're the 2 breads on Shavuos. They're the lechem hapanim, the regular lechem hapanim. There's the 2 karbonos shlamim that are brought on Shavuos. Those are the only 2 carbon shlamims that are tzibur karbonos. All other ones are private. So these shlamims, shlamim is eaten, and this is the only shlamim that's tzibur. So that's what qualifies here. And also the goat, the soya that's brought on Rosh Chodesh. Now, carbon Pesach is interesting. It's a private carbon, but it's considered to be a carbon tzibur because everybody brings one. And that's different than these other things. You do eat it if you bring it bitumah, because obviously you can't bring a carbon pesach if you're not going to eat it. Part of the lachas of carbon pesach is that it has to be eaten. So when it becomes permitted to be brought bitumah, innate in that is that it becomes permitted to be eaten, even though you are tameh. We now begin the Gemara, which wants to know why certain karbanos were included in the list or specifically left off the list of karbanos which can be brought even if everybody is tameh. So the Gemara says, first of all, the Mishnah says a number. It says that there are 5 karbanos that are brought bitumah. The Gemara says, whenever you give me a number, you're excluding something that I would have thought is included. What carbon is there that cannot be brought bitumah that I would have thought could be brought bitumah? So the Gemara says that's a carbon chagiga. A carbon chagiga is considered to be a carbon tzibor because everybody has to bring one. It also has a set time in which it has to be brought. It has to be brought on Yom Tov. Generally, the rule is any carbon tzibor that has to be brought in a certain time. Really, the truth is any carbon at all, but the Rishonim explain here why we say tzibor. But any carbon which has to be brought in a set time, you can bring even bitumah. You could also bring it on Shabbos. So the Gemara says you would have therefore thought that the carbon chagiga can be brought bitumah. The Gemara says it cannot be brought bitumah, and the reason is because it's not really counted as having a set time. It has to be brought on Yom Tov, and it's supposed to be brought the first day of Yom Tov, but it could be pushed off to a different day of Yom Tov. The first day of Yom Tov falls on Shabbos, you push it off to a different day of Yom Tov, and you don't bring it on Shabbos. That being the case, you wouldn't bring it bitumah either. Since it doesn't push away Shabbos, doesn't push away tumah, those two halachas go together. Now the Gemara says, well, why didn't we list the se'irei regalim? There's a carbon chatas that's brought as a goat on Yom Tov. We didn't list that. The only Yom Tov karbonos we listed were the carbon shlomim of Shavuos and the seirim of Rosh Chodesh. Why don't we list the seirim of Yom Tov? So Gemara says, well, they're included in the carbon shlamim of Shavuos. Carbon shlamim of Shavuos is a special carbon for Yom Tov. On Shavuos it's a shlamim. All other yomim tovim it's a sa'ir, it's a chatas, a goat. So that's why we didn't list it, because it's included. The Gemara says, well, if everything's included in the carbon shlamim of Shavuos, so why do we have to list the goats of Rosh Chodesh, the chatas of Rosh Chodesh? That's the same thing. Why does that get a special listing? So the Gemara says, well, the chatas of Rosh Chodesh you would have thought are excluded. You would not have realized that they're included. And the reason is that the source of the halacha that you can bring these karbanos bitzibor when it's tameh, when you're tameh, is from the fact that they're called moyed. We use the word moyed, and it says you have to bring it b'moyada, you have to bring it in its time, and that implies even if the congregation is tameh. Now Rosh Chodesh you would have thought is not a moyed. Moyed means a Yom Tov. Rosh Chodesh is not a moyed. The chiddush therefore is that the goats of Rosh Chodesh, which are chatos, can be brought even in bitumah because Rosh Chodesh is called a mayed, and therefore the word mayed does apply to all of them. Where do you see that Rosh Chodesh is called a mayed? So the Gemara says it's the statement of Abaye. Abaye is talking about the year that Moshe sent Meraglim, and Abaye says that Rosh Chodesh of that year, Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, was a 2-day Rosh Chodesh. We made Rosh Chodesh on the 30th of the month and on the 1st of the month of Av. And the reason we did that is, well, it's not us who did it, but the reason why that was done was that it was worked out the way in order that the Meraglim should come back on the 8th of Av, and they should give their bad report on the evening of the 8th of Av, which is Tisha B'Av, and that Tisha B'Av would then become a day of crying for all generations because of that terrible thing that happened then. Now, when Abaye says this, he quotes a pasuk. The pasuk is from Eicha. It says, "Karalai mayed." You called it a mayed, meaning you established it as Rosh Chodesh Lishbar Bachorai, in order that this should be the day of breaking my children forever. Now, you see that the phrase that teaches us that Rosh Chodesh was established on that day is Karalai mayed. It's called a mayed. So you see, Rosh Chodesh is called a mayed.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.